Hey everyone, welcome to Bill's Mathia. This week is part 3 of our What Do You Mean Average series, which is the rule of 4, which is something that you're only going to find with me. Once again, we're not going to have any football clips, so here's smiling Josh Allen for just a moment. I introduced this graphic last time. We talked about standard deviation, and I'm going to use it today to show how I arrived at the rule of 4 and the utility when it comes to football analysis. One of the things I've said a couple times now in this series is that when we look at an average as a singular point, it does lead to this kind of binary situation of good versus bad. Now, adding standard deviation to the mix allows us to create these zones where we have a large grouping of average in the middle. That's a thought I want you to hold on to for just a moment. And between 1 and 2 standard deviations away from the mean, we do have some statistical significance in some cases, but not usually a ton. And then once we go beyond 2 standard deviations, is really our kind of money zone where we know that things are statistically significant away from that. And I am aware that that particular one does look like a kitty. Moving on though, one of the flaws of standard deviation is that it tends to really isolate such a small number at the top that it's really hard to create categories or tiers. So for instance, in this one with our yards per attempt graphic, it was only Tua Tagovailoa who achieved that statistical significance. Now, one thing to be aware of is that with a sample size of 33 quarterbacks, which is what this was coming from, you do have some difficulty arriving at good statistical validity. So that's why I created this chart. This is tackles per game for defenders in the NFL in the 2022 season. And our gray zone is everything between that -2 to +2 standard deviation, which is generally considered normal or pretty close to normal, which means this section up here, this slice, that's really what's statistically different. This would be our group that ordinarily we think of as kind of elite. Now to arrive at this, we have the top 499 players off the board. So a ton more data to work with. That's why everything's so crunched. Down here with the names, that really is just a sampling. And if you're wondering if any Buffalo Bills are in this zone, we do have Tremaine Edmonds right around there. So with the complexity of that, it's really more effective for us to have kind of quick rules or a rule of thumb, which is where the rule of 4 comes in. So let's take a look at these. I'm a big fan of per drive metrics. So this is defensive statistics, this one and the next one. And this is turnover percentage or the number of drives that result in a defensive takeaway. Now this is just a chart with Buffalo Bills highlighted at 14.3%, which is the 5th best in the league for the 2022 season. But when we're taking a look at this, I've stripped out the average, I've stripped out the standard deviation, and I want to focus on this rule of 4 concept. And overall, this is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Just like the standard deviation group, we're going to break things down into 5 zones. So we do have this large middle zone where pretty much we're just going to call this average, even though you do have some variation between the 13.1 and the 10.2 between the Bengals and the Browns. We're still going to call them pretty close to average. There's not really a ton of separation between those two teams. And it's called the rule of 4 because as we break out beyond these sections, that's where the number 4 is going to come into play. So for a distribution of 32 or the number of teams, or roughly that, we'll talk about that again in a moment, this top 4 concept becomes much more useful. So it's not as inflexible as standard deviation, where maybe only the Cowboys at 16.2% would really stand out as statistically valid, but it's also not overly binary like a singular average would be, where we place things as 16 versus 16. So this grouping of 4 really allows us to maintain a lot of the benefits of kind of both systems. And this is generally how I tend to conceptualize this. Again, this large grouping in the middle as average is pretty consistent with the idea of a normal distribution of population associated with the bell curve that we covered last week, or standard deviation. And when you think about it, that makes sense. The idea of average, as we've said throughout all the videos in this series, is really to identify what's normal. And the definition of normal is, most things. Most things should be normal. Most things should be around average. And allowing about half the league to be there makes a lot of sense. Now, when I use the term elite, if I use that in articles or videos, I am generally referring to top 4. That is generally what I'm talking about. I usually just use the term good. for this section here. And I'll float between these, but bad. I've used yikes. Sometimes use terrible, horrible, something along those lines. Now, this isn't without flaws. So we do see that at this point here and this point, we have these significant jumps within these categories. So even in this elite tier, we have a 0.7 jump between the Eagles and the Jaguars at spots 3 and 4. And the same thing in this bad grouping. We have a pretty significant jump here. So you could actually make an argument that maybe top 3 would be better for this elite group. And in this bad group, maybe you'd want to pull the Falcons into the average group because they are closer to that. And that's not a bad argument to have, for sure. But again, we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for a rule of thumb. And if you're kind of digging into those granular topics to argue, then a rule of thumb is generally working pretty well. Let's take a look at one more chart using the rule of 4. And please note, points per drive here is points allowed per drive, as again, these are defensive statistics. You see similar flaws. So again, would it make sense to maybe have a bottom 5 in this particular metric? Maybe. But again, by labeling this rule of 4, we've hit pretty close. We've hit a pretty good guess on this that does show a grouping that really falls into this terrible category. So if you then start having this conversation, where do the Raiders fit in? Well, you at least have a place to work with that has some validity to start with. And that's really the beauty of the rule of 4, is that it gives us this good talking point that is more accurate than just using average, but again, not so fixated on the statistics like standard deviation would be. So why would we use this? As noted, average just really is not precise. It's a terrible starting point for most conversations on elite versus not elite. Standard deviation requires a ton of work, even if you're using auto calculations and spreadsheets. You do have to do a lot of grouping. You do have to do a lot of things. In order for it to be really accurate, you need that larger group of numbers, like our 499 defensive players. And if you've ever seen any of my work, I hate top 10 lists. They can really just bleep off. Top 10 is terrible, especially when you're talking about groupings of 32, where again, number of NFL teams, that's 31, a little over 31% of the league. So imagine you're standing in a room of 100 people and somebody says, well, who here is elite? And over 30 people stand up. That's not really a very good representation of who's elite or what's really good measure of that. So the rule of 4 does balance, as I've noted a couple times, between average and the standard deviation model. One of the big beauties of it is you don't have to calculate jack. Top 4, that's your elite. Bottom 4, those are your terrible teams. You have another grouping of 4 beyond that, where you can label them as different than average. And then whatever's left in the middle, that's your average. And that leads me to my next point, is that you can use this with larger groups. So if you had a distribution of 50, so maybe top 50 linebackers or something, well, the rule of 4 is still pretty good. Top 4 still makes a lot of sense. Like, that's your guys that you're going to talk about as the best of the best. Now, if you have a top 100, you may have to maybe double that. So top 8 would make sense. But again, even if you were to stick with 4, you're still probably including a larger group than standard deviation would. As remember from our last video, that's generally about 2.1 to 3% of the population would be statistically different from average enough to call them out. So even if you go to a group of 100 and stick with the rule of 4, you're still statistically making a pretty good list. So again, this is why I use that. It's a really handy way to just immediately have a group that balances pretty well between statistically valid and easy. So that's all we have for this week. Don't forget to like, subscribe, check out everything on BuffaloRumblings.com. This will wrap it up for a series on average, but definitely keep these links handy if you're trying to calculate a lot of stuff as we go along, because I do rely on a lot of these concepts quite a bit.